Stalin didn't nearly lose the war because of German tanks, or because of the weather, or even because of overwhelming odds. He nearly lost it because of something far more dangerous: his own mind, his own fear, his own instinct to see enemies everywhere, even where none existed. The story of how the Soviet Union almost collapsed in the opening phase of the war is not just about the German invasion. It's about the psychological world inside Stalin's head, a world built on distrust, suspicion, and the belief that everyone around him was a potential traitor waiting to strike. To understand how close the USSR came to falling apart, you must first understand how Stalin created the perfect conditions for disaster long before the first German soldier crossed the border. He spent the 1930s purging his own military. Officers were arrested, interrogated, pressured, exiled, or simply erased. Entire chains of command vanished overnight. Some of the most capable minds in the Soviet military tradition disappeared into prisons or labor camps. The message to the survivors was crystal clear. Loyalty mattered more than competence. Brutal compliance mattered more than strategy. And this fear created a force that couldn't speak honestly to the leader who controlled everything. By the late 1930s, the Red Army looked enormous on paper, but behind the numbers lay a hollowed institution terrified to make decisions without Stalin's approval. Promotions were based less on talent and more on political reliability. Junior officers were untested, senior officers were frightened, and Stalin believed he had strengthened the army, when in reality he had weakened it so badly that the coming storm was almost guaranteed to overwhelm them. But Stalin's paranoia didn't stop with his own officers. It extended to intelligence. In the months before Germany's invasion, Soviet intelligence agencies were lighting up with warnings. Spy networks in Europe were feeding information straight to Moscow. German troop movements were being tracked. Radio intercepts were decoded. Allies and neutrals alike were telling Stalin the same thing. Germany was preparing to strike. Not in a year, not in months, but soon. And Stalin didn't just ignore the warnings. He actively dismissed them. He believed they were traps, misinformation planted by Britain to drag the Soviet Union into a conflict before it was ready. The idea that Hitler, who had signed a pact with Stalin just 2 years earlier, would betray him seemed impossible in Stalin's mind. His distrust of everyone extended even to the truth itself. If intelligence didn't match his expectations, it was deemed worthless or suspicious. No amount of evidence could shift his thinking. One spy in particular, Richard Sorge, based in Tokyo, sent Stalin some of the most accurate intelligence of the entire war. He provided the exact date range of the invasion. He explained the size of the German buildup. He reported German intentions clearly and confidently, and Stalin dismissed him as if he were a nuisance. As the border lit up with German activity, airfields being expanded, rail lines being strengthened, divisions being repositioned, Stalin still insisted it was nothing. "Germany is not going to fight us," he told his top generals. It was a belief built not on logic, but on fear, because accepting that Germany was preparing to invade meant accepting that Stalin had miscalculated the entire direction of Soviet foreign policy. Paranoia protected his ego, but it came at the cost of millions of lives. The Soviet army was caught completely off guard when the invasion finally began. Planes were lined up wing to wing on airfields like easy targets. Units on the ground weren't mobilized. Ammunition was locked away. Commanders had their hands tied because issuing defensive orders required Stalin's direct permission, and Stalin refused to give it until the skies were already filled with German aircraft. But the greatest damage Stalin did wasn't just ignoring intelligence, it was isolating himself from reality. His generals were scared to tell him the truth. Reports that contradicted his worldview were softened or buried. The most dangerous thing in the Soviet Union wasn't making a military mistake, it was making Stalin angry. That meant the entire system, The entire chain of command and every officer responsible for the defense of the nation walked on eggshells while the most powerful army in the world prepared to strike. When the attack came on June 22, 1941, Stalin froze. He refused to believe it. He refused to issue declarations. He refused to address the nation. For hours that turned into days, there was confusion at the very top of the Soviet leadership. Germany was advancing with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet divisions were collapsing. Cities were falling. Commanders were desperately seeking orders. And the man who controlled the fate of the entire country fell into a paralysis caused by shock, disbelief, and fear. His paranoia had created the disaster he now faced, and for a moment it looked like the USSR might crumble entirely. But something strange happened. Something that even Stalin didn't expect. The system he had spent years controlling suddenly had to run without him. Generals began making decisions, officers began improvising, units began fighting not because they were told to, but because survival demanded it. While Stalin hid from the truth, the Soviet people were already fighting for their lives. When Stalin finally re-emerged days later, the situation was so catastrophic that even he had to accept reality. His paranoia didn't disappear, but he began to adjust to it. He realized he needed to loosen his grip, at least slightly. He restored certain officers he once distrusted. He allowed generals to act with more flexibility. He gave more power to those who could stabilize the front. It was not a full transformation, but it was enough to keep the Soviet Union alive in its darkest hour. Yet his paranoia still caused major failures. He refused to allow retreats even when they were strategic. He believed giving up ground was a sign of weakness. That belief trapped entire armies. Encirclements became common. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were isolated because Stalin ordered them to stand firm, even when doing so guaranteed disaster. These weren't tactical decisions, they were psychological ones. Stalin believed that willpower alone could shape the battlefield, even when the situation demanded flexibility. His fear of disloyalty extended to civilians as well. Policies were created that punished anyone suspected of wavering commitment. Civilians in occupied territories were treated with suspicion even after liberation. Entire ethnic groups were uprooted and relocated because Stalin believed they might collaborate with the enemy. These mass relocations weren't based on evidence. They were based on superstition and paranoia. And they cost the war effort manpower, resources, and stability. Yet despite Stalin's flaws, despite the crippling distrust, the disastrous decisions, the ignored warnings, and the brutal rigidity, the Soviet Union survived. It survived not because of Stalin's paranoia, but in spite of it. What saved the country was the resilience of the people, the courage of the soldiers, the sacrifice of officers on the ground, and the sheer determination of a society fighting for its existence. Stalin's own paranoia nearly cost him everything, but his ability to slowly, reluctantly adapt allowed him to steady the nation just enough to recover. As the tide began to turn, first outside Moscow, then at Stalingrad, then across the front, Stalin's confidence grew. He made fewer catastrophic decisions. He relied more on his generals. He began to trust the Red Army's capability, even if he never fully trusted the people commanding it. But the shadow of paranoia never left. It shaped the entire Soviet war effort. It slowed mobilization. It blinded him to danger. It filled prisons with experienced officers who were desperately needed at the front. It caused the biggest intelligence failure of the war. And it turned early Soviet losses into some of the worst military catastrophes in history. To say Stalin nearly lost the war is not an exaggeration. It is the truth. The Soviet Union was moments away from collapse, not because Germany was unstoppable, but because Stalin's own mindset created the perfect opening for disaster. The war became a struggle not just against an invading enemy, but against the limitations of a leader who trusted no one. not even his own eyes. And yet the story has a deeper meaning, because the moment Stalin allowed even a small amount of trust into the system, the Soviet war effort transformed. Commanders learned, soldiers adapted, strategy improved, and a nation that seemed moments from destruction began to push back so fiercely that it changed the course of world history. In the end, Stalin's paranoia shaped the beginning of the war, but it was the courage and resilience of millions of ordinary people who defined how it ended. The Soviet Union survived not because of the man at the top, but because the country refused to break even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. And that is the real story of how close Stalin came to losing everything, and how the Soviet people pulled their country back from the edge of destruction. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you hit that subscribe button to support the channel, and tell me below, what do you want me to break down next?